Things Policy, a daily podcast supported by Pragati, a flagship media initiative of the Takshashila institution. We're a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like to bring a fresh perspective to Indian affairs and an Indian perspective to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to All Things Policy. So in the past 1 year, we have seen AI go from being powering prediction algorithms in the background to not now seemingly having intelligent conversations with us, answering questions, or even creating art. So AI is transforming our lives in a very big way. So to talk about where India stands in AI innovation and how we can move up the value chain, I have with me my colleague Shailesh Chitnis, who has just published a discussion document on these topics. So welcome, Shailesh.
Thank you, Bharath.
So first look at where India stands, right? So US and China seem to be far ahead of the others in research and innovation in the AI space. So from your perspective, Shailesh, where does India stand and what are the implications of this widening gap in AI capabilities between these two countries and the rest of the world?
Sure. So I think, Bharath, like you rightly pointed out at the beginning, AI is mainstream. So it's no longer a technology that is futuristic or things like that. I mean, the biggest example is, of course, ChatGPT, which has taken over our lives seemingly. And so as we look at that, I think it's interesting to see where does India fit in with respect to all these trends, right? So if you think about AI, typically the ingredients that go into a country having good capabilities in AI, they fall into 4 buckets. So first is, of course, its own R&D capacity, the ability to innovate, the ability to take those innovations to market. So that's number one. The second is the talent pool that is available. And by talent pool, I mean researchers, developers, kind of the entire ecosystem of folks that are essentially building the models, testing it out and deploying it. So that's number 2. Number 3 is capital. So it's basically access to money, as we'll talk about, because this is not something that is a cheap endeavor by any stretch of imagination. So that would be the third bucket. And lastly, it is supportive public infrastructure, right? So by that, I include stuff like regulation, strong data privacy laws, kind of that entire ecosystem that supports the AI landscape. So these would be the 4 broad buckets that you can think about. And when you look at it from those metrics, India really doesn't do very well other than in the talent category. So we can get into each of these different elements, but if at a very high level, what you'd notice is if you look at different measures of India's research output, for example, we do publish a lot of papers, but then those papers are not typically the most influential or the most cited papers or research that is really moving the field forward. It is more of a volume game rather than a quality game. When we talk about capital, yes, India is one of the biggest startup hubs in the world. I think last year it got something like the 4th highest funding behind US, China, and UK. So it's pretty sizable market for startup funding. But even there, a lot of the startups that are kind of sucking up capital, they are focused what I would call more on the application layer, B2C services, things like that, not very much on the quote unquote deep tech. These are the really innovative technologies, right? And so on both those measures, we don't do really well. Now, on one measure, we do very well is talent. And that's not a surprise. It's not just because of the size of the country, but also the quality of the institutions that we have, particularly at the undergraduate level, the IITs, ISCs, NITs. I mean, there's a whole host of them now. We are really good at producing talented engineers, talented scientists. But even there's a catch. We do produce them, but we can't retain them. So most of these talented scientists who are really kind of at the top of their game, they prefer going to the US or other Western countries to continue either their graduate education or work for big tech companies there. So that in a nutshell is where I would say India is. If I had to summarize it, I would say like it's US and China that are by far the dominant players. Then there's a very large gap, and then you have the other set of countries. And then really, I would put India far behind all of them based on these different factors.
Right. India cannot be a supplier of talent forever, and we need to move up the value chain. But in order to understand the implications of this gap, so what would you think, like going forward as AI gets embedded into a lot of the algorithms that we use, a lot of the military applications? So what could be the implications of this gap between say, the US and China and the rest of the world? Is there something that, are there risks involved that we need to mitigate against?
Yes, so I think one of the things is we have a very good example from semiconductor space, right? Where during the late 80s and early 90s, we did have an opportunity to kind of seriously think about semiconductor manufacturing, and we essentially missed the boat. Now, the government has become a lot more serious about semiconductor manufacturing, investing a lot of money either through incentives or through different policy regulations that are encouraging foreign investment. But we essentially are late to the game in semiconductors, right? And we are now trying to catch up as fast as we can. I think there's a risk that if we don't do something similar with AI, we could be left behind, and we would then have to try very hard to catch up once we realize the importance of it. So in areas where we would hurt, for example, today if you think about it, ChatGPT-3, like we talked about, it's great. They just released another new model, GPT-4. What you'll notice is GPT-4 is completely closed source, which is the opposite of the name of the company, OpenAI. It's actually closed AI. So the underlying model is really not transparent. It's a black box. So you feed the data in, you feed the questions in, you get a question, you get the output. But you really don't know what's going under it. Now, there is a parallel thread of open source models, open source AI, open source data, all these things that are happening. But increasingly, what you're starting to see is those are starting to diverge. On one hand, you have very strong proprietary closed source models. And on the other hand, you have kind of the open ecosystem. Now, which way it goes, that you can't really tell at this point, but it's very clear that if we don't have the capability to even build or modify these foundational models, and by foundational models, I mean the core models, for example, the large language models, the image models, all these ones that are driving a lot of the generative AI right now. If we don't have capabilities to actually work on these models ourselves, we will be relying a lot on big tech or Western companies as essentially as consumers of their models, right? So today, if you think about it, India generates vast amounts of data. Think about the UPI transaction volumes that go through. In the future, if health records actually get digitized and the health stack takes off, we'll be generating massive amounts of healthcare data as well. So without our own models to be able to leverage that data, we would then become a data provider as well. So that would be the second kind of challenge that comes up. The other one is, like you alluded to, AI is being embedded in different elements of warfare now. And I think the Chinese have taken a particularly public stance in terms of what they would call, quote unquote, intelligent warfare, which is embedding AI in a lot of their different applications. And without us having our own capabilities to do that, we would again be relying a lot on US or Western allies as suppliers of our data, right? So there are multiple implications of that. Some of them are purely commercial, like we would just be relying on Western companies, paying them for licensing, stuff like that, without capabilities of our own. And then some of them are more strategic from a national security standpoint.
Right. When you mentioned that open source models lag far behind the proprietary models that are out there. Generally, there's this trend in open source software that usually in around 7 years or so, there's usually an open source version of a proprietary software. But in this particular field, like in AI or in the models algorithms that are required to build complex models. So this is something new, and I don't know if that trend will hold for this area. So it's something that we'll have to wait and watch. But like I think you've written in your report, the open source models are orders of magnitude behind the proprietary ones, that the large AI models that are out there right now. So I think also that given the importance of whatever we're talking right now, the US has recognized how that China is competing in this space and the gap is closing. So they chip sanctions, and all of these are measures that are introduced to, slow China down in this space. So, and also the India-China collaboration on critical and emerging technologies, that seems to be an initiative that could be useful for India to leverage to kind of catch up with both of them, right? And that's a limited window that we have to make progress and do something in this thing.
Yeah, so just a correction that it's the India-US collaboration, not the India-China. I think the India-China collaboration on AI would be very interesting. You're absolutely right. I think coming back to your point on open source, to be fair, for example, Google and Meta, they have also released a lot of their models. But just the pace at which these models are evolving, that is something I've not seen happen before in other areas, right? Other technology areas. Like it just seems, it was only, I think, like, I don't know, in October or last August or September when GPT 3.5 was released, and now we're in GPT 4. and it's just been evolved. Things have been evolving so fast in generative AI as well as other fields. And so the reason I think that is an important aspect for us is, yes, there could be open source models out there, but are we able to actually adapt those open source models for even our use case? So to give you a very concrete example, currently large language models are all the rage. So you kind of feed in a question, it gives you a very intelligent answer. But if you think about it, it's pretty much trained on English language. Now, what if you wanted to do something similar in, say, regional languages in India, in Hindi or in Tamil, right? We don't have the capabilities today to create an Indic version of ChatGPT. And without that, again, it gets back to the original point where we'll be relying on a very Western or a US or an English-centric view, which may not serve the needs of all the people in our country. If you think about education, healthcare, we would need to get into India-specific applications as well. So I think that is where kind of the need to have capabilities that either take open source models immediately or start to build our own proprietary models maybe down the road, that becomes very critical.
Right. So building good AI models requires, like you mentioned, it requires the research on the models, it requires the data that it works on, the compute, which is very expensive, and talent. Now, assuming that you solve the compute and the talent and put in the resources, now the models and training data sets form two important dimensions. How could the model will perform? Now, so what are the best ways for India to slide up the value chain, considering we are far behind in both of these areas?
Yeah, I think your framing of the ingredients is quite good, which is compute, talent, data, and algorithm. Talent, like we said, India is good. There are definitely challenges in terms of retaining them, but we do have a good start. With compute, like you mentioned, today, there's not much India can do on compute because Google, Amazon, and Microsoft, they just have such a vast scale that we will have to, the infrastructure or platform layer, we have to be takers. So I think those two things we can keep aside as you've pointed out. Now, if you think about algorithms and data, the way I think about it is in two forms. If I think about algorithms like we've been discussing, there are open algorithms or open models and closed algorithms or proprietary models. That's on one dimension. On the other dimension, you can think about data the same way. There's publicly available data and there's proprietary data. So publicly available data would be things like I can just get off the web using a Google search like Wikipedia, I don't know, all these scrollable URLs, stuff like that. Proprietary would be things that are kind of not easily accessible. These could be things like they exist, data that exists within an enterprise's boundary, or could be certain sensitive or closed off records that are available from the government, right? So you have open data and then you have what I would call as closed data. For India, I think the best part to start out is leverage the open source models and the open data that is available to start kind of making a move towards understanding or using these models and adapting them to our own use case. Over time, start to layer in some of the more proprietary data that we could have access to by virtue of India stack, by virtue of the health stack, all these things with appropriate safeguards, of course, and then make the move to the right to the proprietary models. I think it would be too much to expect us to directly start going out and building all these models on our own. I think what is more feasible is for us to take a lot of the open source work that has already been done and then adapt it to our needs, which also has the benefit of being useful for other players as well. So far we've only been talking about India, but whatever applies to India also applies to other countries in quote unquote the global south, where they are essentially becoming algorithm takers, technology takers. I think if India takes the lead on this, similar to how India Stack is now being offered to other countries that want to build up a digital public infrastructure, I think if we do make progress on this, we can also layer in an AI application layer on top of this digital public infrastructure.
And that will be a good start. And then we can build the competence required for developing the more complex models that are the real game changers, right?
Absolutely. And to be fair, right, a lot of the open source models that are out there are pretty advanced and should fit the need for what we want to do. The challenge is, like we've been discussing, is adapting it to Indian specific needs. Now, the Indian specific needs could be either local language needs, or it could be Indian specific solutions in healthcare and education that are very different from what may be there in the US, right? So I think that is where a lot of the work has to be done in terms of adapting it to our specific requirements.
Right. Okay, we'll take a quick break and we'll be back to talk about how we can solve for the other two problems that we're talking about.
Sure.
Welcome back, everyone. And so we're talking about how India is lagging behind in AI innovation and the pathways that we can use to get there. Now let's just look into the other aspect. Now we're talking about how to build that AI innovation ecosystem and what should the policy for that be like. So now, if you look at the cost of running such a large language model, so estimates suggest that the cost of running ChatGPT, which is an AI-powered chatbot, is close to $1 million a day. Now, building large language AI models are prohibitively expensive. Now, the high costs have meant that this research is happening more in industry than in academia. Now, in India, we see that investments in R&D are only around 0.7% of the GDP compared to around 2% of GDP in China or in US. Now, and even that 0.7% is largely government investment in R&D. So the private sector falls far behind. And given this environment, given these conditions that are existing in the Indian R&D landscape, what can India do to become an AI power? What could be are there any policy interventions that are necessary? How can this be achieved, Shailesh?
Yeah. So I think personally for me, when I started kind of working on this report, my initial bias was, like most things think about in India, the government must do X, Y, and Z, right? They need to take a stand and do these things. But as you mentioned, some of the numbers, the challenge with kind of moving our innovation forward or starting to get more innovation for the amount of money we put in, I don't think the issue is with the government specifically. I think it's the private sector right now. And the reason is, if you think about research, all research is not same. You have very basic research that is kind of doing very experimental or theoretical work. From that, then you build on and take that into applied research so that you take that work and apply it to particular use cases. And then finally, you have development, which actually takes it to market, right? So you essentially have a pipeline of research with typically academic or research labs focused on basic to applied, and then startups and technology companies or organizations focused on applied to experimental. So that's how the ideal pipeline should flow. But in India, it's actually very skewed because we don't seem to have a good rate of transfer of our research from the lab to what I would call the apps, right? If you look at the rate of transfer of technology from lab to app, we lag very far behind when compared with US and China and some of the other countries. And part of the reason, of course, is our academic institutions can be a lot more productive in terms of their research output and bias it towards application-oriented technologies. But part of the reason is also that the private sector has not been pulling its weight in R&D. So R&D is research and development. And I don't think the private sector is pulling enough of weight in research. In development, yes, but it is mostly around taking existing technologies and applying it to the market, right? So I think that is where a lot of the policy implications are coming out, at least in the short term, which is, let's not look towards the government for putting in more money into academic institutions, because that's not where the immediate problem is. Of course, we need to get a lot more productive and that needs to improve. But to really kickstart these things, I think the private sector needs to step up, put in a lot more money when it comes to the R&D aspect of it, particularly in the applied and experimental development, and then build on that. So this is I would say, a theme that applies across the board for most of the scientific R&D we do, but particularly when it comes to AI and technology-oriented R&D, I think this is something very important, and it has implications in terms of some of the recommendations that we have as well.
So from the perspective of the private sector putting in more R&D, is there any mechanism to encourage more investment? Is there something that the government should be doing in that space?
Yeah, so one of the things that we've proposed, and again, this is a discussion paper, so the point of the discussion paper is to spur discussion and kind of get ideas. And so we've put forth one particular idea. And one of our ideas is India has not had a good record in creating corporate labs or private-driven research. So one of our proposals is actually creating a privately funded lab that is actually focused on foundational models in AI. And the reason for making it privately funded is twofold. First and foremost, like we mentioned already, private sector needs to chip in and it needs to start kind of pulling its weight in development. But the second reason also is that by making it privately funded, we are going to tie it very close to the applications as well as the use cases that it needs to be, so that it's much more market focused from that standpoint. And lastly, it will also be a lot more agile because it won't have some of the overheads and some of the trade-offs that typically most government-funded or government organizations need to deal with. This can be a lot more agile, and agility is something that is very much needed in this particular field. So we've called this organization Bharath AI, which is essentially a lab. We have a strawman estimate in terms of what kind of investment it would need over a 5-year stretch. It's not a small sum of money. We estimate anywhere between $200 to $250 million over a period of 5 years. A bulk of that money would go towards funding or attracting talent back from US and other areas so that we get those high quality researchers back into India. And it also goes into the compute as well as all the digital infrastructure that is needed to run these kind of models. So those are the two areas where you'd be spending a lot of money to get this off the ground. But like I said, the benefits, if we do succeed in this, are definitely worth kind of this type of an investment.
Right. And given how, we see the importance applications of AI with ChatGPT and Dolly and AI-powered search. So earlier it was in the background and it was just working for you, but now you can use these yourselves and you can see the potential of these applications. So I think there's a lot of catching up that India needs to do, and this would be a great first step to get started. So any final comments, Shailesh, before to summarize what we have been talking about?
Yeah, so I think as we release this report and we've been sharing with folks, it's been good to get a lot of feedback. Folks agree with some elements, they may not agree with others. But I think the entire point is twofold. First, let's actually start a debate in terms of what do we need to do right away. And second is also being more realistic about our capabilities of where we are. Because if we need to improve and we need to catch up with US and China, we need to be a lot more honest in our assessment of what our capabilities are today without having kind of rose-colored glasses, as it were, right? So I think that is kind of the two things that I hope this report can accomplish, which is gets us on a more realistic and pragmatic field in terms of our capabilities. And second is spurring a lot of conversation. So if anybody disagrees or they have other opinions, please reach out to us. And we are now having a lot of these conversations. So would like to hear from more folks.
Thanks, Shailesh. This has been a fascinating conversation. And for all of you who are interested in this report, who are interested in learning more about how important AI is to India and what we can do to improve our abilities in this space, do check out Shailesh's report. The link will be in the show notes. And thank you everyone for listening in, and see you all tomorrow.
Thank you.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @Takshashila INST or our website takshashila.org.in.